Today's Friday, October 3rd. We're on the calendar from 1:15 to 2:15. It's now 1:16 p.m. We're here to discuss AO 2025-93 and 93S, ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code Chapter 1505 and 1510 to require residential rental property owners provide tenants financial relocation assistance following issuance of notice to vacate, and amending Title 8 to enact a new section 8.30.200 to make a failure to comply with an enforcement order or notice to vacate punishable as misdemeanor offenses. So we'll start with introductions.
George Martinez.
Aaron Baldwin Day.
Zach Johnson,
Jared Garker.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant.
Daniel Bolland.
Yarrow Silvers.
Do we have anyone on the phone? No one. Okay, thanks. We're also joined by our code enforcement team and Quincy Arms from the Department of Law, our municipal attorney's office, and a couple more attorneys in the audience. I'm going to start by asking you, Ms. Silvers, do you have the amendments? Has that been incorporated anywhere? Or should we ask the attorneys to print those amendments so those can also be? It is in there? Okay, thanks. Never mind, the amendments are here. That's my question. So I don't know who called for this work session specifically, but we recognize at the meeting on Tuesday that we bogged down into deep sausage making because of it. So who would like to take the floor to start the conversation? Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep it brief. I think we already mentioned Tuesday the intent of this, and really it's meant to be a narrowly tailored solution that's trying to accomplish two things. One, to ensure accountability for bad actor landlords, and hopefully by having more consequences, encourage them to do better up front. And then also in these exceptional circumstances to make sure that it's not the tenants who are punished. So again, our vision for this is to for it to be a piece of code that is not heavily utilized, but is there when we need it. And I think probably what would be most useful in sort of explaining for people what the current process looks like today so that we have a better understanding of how we get to the point where a structure is determined to be that it needs to be vacated. And then maybe if code enforcement could talk a little bit about what would be different if this is adopted. And if you just introduce yourself for the record and maybe give us a quick overview.
Scott Campbell. I'm the Chief of Inspections and Supervisor of the code enforcement staff that we have for the municipality of Anchorage. And I think we developed this AO for several properties across town that we've had to deal with in the past several years where we deal almost specifically with the minimum thermal heat standards per Title 15. So one of the essential things we need in our buildings is heat, especially living in Alaska. I don't think there's any argument there. And code says in 15.10.110, the minimum thermal heat standards and the time you can spend in that residence without heat. And then it specifically states that the landlord shall provide rental assistance for those people if they cannot provide the heat. That's where we run into the crux of the problem. So we can enforce this code, but if we go to a landlord and say, you have to move these people, what if they say no? We have no further enforcement at that point. We're stuck. We can go through all these steps, but they're going to keep continuing to say no. By allowing to have this relocation assistance, it allows us to follow through with the code requirements and allows us to actually move these people and get them into a healthy location temporarily and force that landlord who's negligent to provide some sort of resources for these individuals. So that's the intent of this code. And we've developed this through specifically Lucas Cleek from Code Abatements run into this several times in the last several years. And it's very difficult to deal with these property owners because they're well-funded. A lot of the times they're corporations. And it's just difficult to get them to provide any assistance to their landlords when they've obviously failed to neglect the building.
Two questions. Roughly how often in a typical year would you encounter the sort of circumstance where you might get to the point where you consider issuing a notice to vacate?
It's very seldom. The majority of our notice to vacates are for illegal occupying, and that's typically because somebody has broken into the residence, They're not the tenant, they're not the landlord, they're illegally there, or they're in a location without heat, hot water, gas. That's a mandatory. So almost majority of our notice to vacates are for illegal occupancy. And most of the time vagrants have broken in. In fact, I shared this with the CEDC yesterday. We're seeing quite often people using battery operated chainsaws and sawzalls to cut holes in the wall cavities. They enter through the building, not through the door, through the side of the building. They'll cut a hole in the floorboards and use it to defecate into the crawl space. And eventually, within a matter of months, if we don't find these places quick enough and we don't get them boarded up quick enough, they eventually become so dilapidated that the building becomes beyond the point of economic feasibility to repair. So it's kind of a constant problem with that illegal occupancy. But I think what the intent of this piece is for those larger establishments where the landlord fails to maintain the residence, fails to maintain the water heater, the boiler system, and over the course of time, they neglect to help their tenants, and now the tenants are stuck. They don't have heat, they don't have hot water, and there's nothing really in code that allows us to hold that owner accountable.
I mean, that is, I will say, yes, the intent of what we're trying to address here, but just sort of ballpark for those circumstances, not counting the illegally occupied structures. I don't think anyone would really challenge that. That's a problem. But for the legally occupied ones that reach the point where they're no longer safe for habitation, just roughly an annual year, 1, 5, 10.
I've been here now since July of 2022, and we've had to post a notice to vacate twice, where the living conditions were so bad that we felt like those folks shouldn't be there anymore.
So twice since 2010?
22.
Okay. 2022.
Yeah.
And then just real quickly, and then I'll let our people jump. Just how do you get to that point, right? Because it's not like you just walk in and be like, oh, heat's off, everyone out of here.
This is years. The two places that we have placed a notice to vacate and remove the occupants, we're talking over a decade worth of code enforcement involvement. And the last thing we want to do is remove somebody from their home. Our main purpose is to work with that landlord, work with that property owner to bring the building into compliance. And that's 10 years of us trying to help that person and them not maintaining it, them not putting the money that they should in to make that place safe. And to the point where, it's September and there's little kids running around in standing water on the first floor because it's leaking from the roof through 3 floors to the bottom floor. There's exposed 120, 240 volt electrical panels and little kids running around in water. That's where we kind of need to step in. It's a life safety hazard.
Thank you.
First, I have Ms. Brawley. You're not one of the sponsors, are you? Ms. Baldwin Day? Oh, you are? Okay, you can speak as sponsor if it's germane to the question.
I was just going to ask Mr. Campbell to, outline in a little bit more detail, like from the time that a complaint is issued, right? Can you talk us through at a high level, not necessarily, but just high level, the process that you go through to work with the property owner and where in that process a notice to vacate is actually issued? Like that, I think that would be helpful for members to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically we're a complaint driven system. So the majority of our code violations come from a tenant complaint. Usually at that point, we show up at the tenant's request. We'll investigate the area to see if there is a code violation. And then we follow the steps in Title 15 or 23, depending on where that violation resides. And so typically we'll work with these property owners for months to resolve it. It can be sometimes years.
Yeah.
But most of the time it's months, years. If the code violation continues to persist, then we'll go to a notice and order. So typically we do a notice of violation. That's a 3 days for the owner to respond in the notice and violation. And then if they don't respond or don't show that they're producing some sort of effort to fix the problem, we'll move to a notice and order, which we can require them to either fix the problem or find a solution. And then if that continues to exist and they don't, and it is a life safety concern, we're following code. Code requires us to do this.
So to follow up, so you have the notice of violation, then
Mhm.
the notice of order, lots of communication happening with the property owner
Absolutely.
during that time. And then ultimately, if there's no responsiveness or progress isn't being made, that's when the notice to vacate is
Mhm.
posted.
And I just want to reiterate, the notice to vacate is something we avoid at all costs. For one, it's an extremely time-consuming thing for us. Two, it's not something that we feel provides the best solution. The best solution is for those people for that landowner to fix that problem, so those people don't have to move.
And sometimes we'll even reschedule the notice to vacates in order to provide more time for tenants.
Okay, then in the queue, I miss probably then Ms. Silvers.
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate really a better understanding kind of the long tail, the few situations this is and how extreme it is. So, but my question is really, I understand you said there's not a lot of tools in code when it gets to a certain point. I also know that especially for companies who are dealing with non-compliance, making it cost a lot of money is a big deterrent, right? It's not just a cost of doing business. So I'm wondering, why we don't just layer on a whole bunch of fines. I'm sure that happens, but I'm just wondering, because that's another thing is okay, $500,000 fine, right? Like something that's very extreme but gets people's attention. I'm just wondering why this approach instead of something like that.
We have several properties where we have millions of dollars worth of fines on them. And their civil penalties, we're able to apply a $500 a day civil penalties to some of our notice of violations. That's our problem. We have a lot of people who continue to be negligent. They're extremely cognizant of the problem. They know the problem. They know what the fix is. Been very communicative with them, but they fail to provide that solution. And that's what we're trying to do with this code change. We're trying to provide something that we can follow through, right? If we don't have any follow through, then it doesn't add a lot of teeth to the codes that we have.
Okay, and I think Ms. Arns wants to answer, because I think the other question is, what is the legal limit on what we can do with fines?
Oh,
Well, if you can respond to that, but
Yeah,
also I
well,
know
I
there's
was-
limits on what we can do.
Sorry, Quincy Arms through the chair. We have liens, they're recorded against the property. They're not recorded against the individual or the corporation that owns it. So that's the problem we've run into. They just let the fines stack up. And if they never sell the property, they don't have to worry about those fines. It takes our office taking that lien to court, turning it into a judgment, finding the person to go after, collection efforts, years and years of effort. We've done it, but we don't do it on a regular basis.
Change that. Ms. Silvers.
I think the first question that comes to mind is, why can't we strengthen our ability to collect on those fines? And I have a lot more questions, but let's start with that one.
We're doing that too. Multifaceted approach here. But I agree with you.
Okay. Which kind of brings me to the second question. If you can't collect on the fines, how is this new ordinance going to be different? How are we going to be able to collect on the relocation assistance if we can't already collect on the fines? Particularly if you're dealing with an out-of-state landlord. Maybe they don't care if there's a criminal penalty against them in Alaska.
You got an answer for that?
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Take it.
Well, I feel with these, I think that's why we're introducing the lien language. I don't know the exact AO, what that is. We talked about it yesterday at the CEDC meeting.
103.
103, is that what it is? Okay. So we're looking at this from trying to do a multifaceted approach. Collection of liens is the other hurdle we have. Nobody's paying up. With this, we do have some funding set aside. I think it's not just about collection of liens, it's about the health and safety of the residents of Anchorage. And last year we had an establishment with over,
It was,
can't say names, how many people were in the place?
150.
150 people.
60 unit apartment building. They ran out of, their boilers failed in October and they are still not corrected. They were provided electric heaters, tiny electric heaters that would overwhelm their electrical system because the building was built in the 50s. And they're still having troubles there today. They paid a fine of $10,000 thus far. And they're still being fined because they're still in violation of the code. And you know, one thing to keep in mind is the tenants pay, you know, $1,400 a month for rent, and they haven't had heat in 8 months.
Yep.
And they're not getting any breaks on electrical. Yeah.
So I think that's the intent of this, is to help those individuals. And you know, a lot of this stuff's never been done before. But that's why we're doing it. I think there's definitely a need for us to act on some of these negligent property owners. And if we can't follow through from start to finish with this, it's really difficult for us to enforce and have some sort of positive outcome with it. And, you know, I can say you have to do this, and they can say no all day long until I tell them you have to do this or else, and we have that follow through. And this code change would allow us to have that follow through.
Can the municipality go in and replace the boiler? You know, like you said, a lot of these things are due to heat problems and stuff like that. Can the municipality actually step in and replace that and then bill the owner?
We've been asked that question a lot. That is a very difficult thing that we'd have to do. For one, you're talking about an older building from the 1950s. We go in, we take responsibility for that boiler. You might need to upgrade the whole heating system. You might need to go farther than just the boiler. It's not that simple. That's why we avoid that direction. And plus, with these negligent property owners, we'd just be in the same position again. If we went in and spent all the time and effort to put the boiler in, they wouldn't pay us back, that's for sure.
So, Ms. Soers, I'm gonna ask we roll through the queue and come back because we got a number of folks. So next, Mr. Gerker.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to start really quick with just a couple comments. Comment first, Mr. Campbell, thank you so much for all you guys do. I really appreciated your help with that property off of Eagle River Loop. And then to the sponsors, I see where you guys' hearts are at on this. I love that. I want to get to yes. I do have some questions though. Are there any other sections of code, or is there anywhere else in our law that has the government coming in and paying a civil penalty for a bad actor? Like you've got two parties here, the landlords and the tenants, and we're now saying that the government's going to step in and pay the civil penalties against one of the parties. Is that anywhere else, or is this brand new?
It's an attorney question.
Maybe an attorney question, yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the
Yeah,
question.
I understand that the ordinance requires providing relocation assistance to the tenants, but it doesn't have the government actually paying civil penalties. In fact, that money would be recouped by the municipality when they went after the landlord.
Right, that's what
For
I'm
the civil
saying,
penalties.
is it says that the municipality is gonna give an advance on a civil penalty from one party to another. That's what it says here. If the owner fails to complete payment of relocation assistance,
Right.
the municipality may advance the cost of the relocation.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. A civil penalty means money paid by a private party to the government as punishment. Well, not, yeah, essentially as a punishment for violating an administrative code. So I think that's where our confusion was. We aren't doing that. We're helping out the tenants on the front end because there is no mechanism right now that we've been able to identify to help the tenant. And that's why we're kind of stuck in this situation where we're just adding more fines because a notice to vacate puts the entire onus on the tenant themselves to find a new housing solution. And if they're staying in a place like this to begin with, they obviously don't have that many options. So yeah, I get that the municipality would be fronting money to a private citizen, but that money would be accrued back to the municipality when it went after the landlord for the penalties it already accrued.
Yeah.
So if I might, I think I could add that at least over the last 5 years, there have been a number of times when the municipality did provide specific assistance to individuals who are facing relocation or rental issues or any number of considerations relative to hiccups in the market in COVID era and other times. And so like an apples to apples comparison would be, does the muni have a history of providing some assistance to individuals who were losing their housing? Yes. Then the second question is, does the municipality have a means ever to recoup those dollars? And I think in those rental assistance programs, we never did.
Okay.
But in this case, we are recouping from the entity that proposed entity who has been in some way gathering resources from the problem.
Sure.
So that's how I would see the answer. It's two
Okay.
parts.
Okay. So there is some precedent here then. If this isn't completely brand new.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would also offer in a similar vein that in situations where you have like a vacant and abandoned property, it has been the practice of the municipality to, in very limited cases, to essentially front money to the vacant and abandoned property owner for demolition of that property, place a lien on the property for the cost of demolition, the owner sells the property, and the municipality recoups the funds. So there is also that precedent as well.
And an administrative system to actually process it.
And then just very quickly to add to that, we did make an amendment in the Q1 budget revisions to dedicate some funds that could be used for this purpose. So there is a pool of money sitting there now that
Okay.
could use to cover these costs.
All of that sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Second question, really fast. You said that you've issued 2 notices since 2022. Was the property in the article that was attached to this, was that one of those properties? Will this resolve that issue that those tenants were facing?
I wouldn't say those first 2 examples kind of coincide with this. I think this is more for those, it's specifically for those properties that don't have heat and hot water and those essential utilities. Some of these older properties that we're looking at, I mean, it may or may not apply depending on the circumstances. But generally, we are always trying to make sure that we work with the property owner to keep those people in there first. So I think the intent of this is for when we do have larger complexes where they need heat and it's the middle of January and the owner is dragging their feet.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna put a little note on the record. If we get 2 more attorneys here, the assembly is outnumbered.
Play zone coverage. Who gets this isn't a question for the attorneys. Who gets a misdemeanor charge if it's an out-of-state LLC? Like who are we actually going after? I guess I don't really have a lot of clarity on that.
I mean, if it were an out-of-state actor that had violated Anchorage state law, there could be an arrest warrant issued, but, outside of that person actually setting a principal actor for an LLC or somebody like that setting foot in Anchorage or within our jurisdiction, I mean, that's what would be required to actually prosecute someone. Under Alaska state law, it does allow principal actors for a corporation to be prosecuted for the acts of their agents. So you basically incur additional elements that you have to prove. One, that this principal actor had the authority over the LLC, and that they knew and were aware of the actions taken by their agent within the scope of their responsibilities.
Do we anticipate that's going to be done? what I'm wondering, this is maybe more broadly, are we setting up a paper tagger here with the criminal penalties as in this AO? That might be more of a
Yeah.
metaphor question. I don't know.
Yeah, I can't speak to
Rhetorical.
the to the extradition process for the lower 48.
Okay.
Sorry.
Copy that. That's fine. I
We
might have
did,
more
we
questions
wanted to
later,
at
but-
least have the option, and we did clear it through our prosecutor's office. So it's a possibility. How about that?
I think it's arguable that at least a substantial portion of them will be Alaskans located in Alaska, that the outside corporation, that is one subset, but there are a number of others. And so I think there's a broad swath for that question to be responded to. Now, Mr. Vaughn had a kind of a precedent question. Mr. Vaughn.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, I know we have the S version in front of us and we can all read it, but maybe for the public record, it'd be helpful to know which amendments were incorporated into the S version.
Yeah, I can take that. So running through the incorporated amendments, amendment number 2, the 24-hour advance notice has been, I would say, substantially incorporated. Essentially say that if it is any party other than the occupant directing the inspection, that the tenant gets the 24-hour notice. We also incorporated amendment number 4, that is in the S version. And then for amendment number 5, we tried to capture the intent of that, but there were some changes we made to the language, we think, to make it more, anyways, it's substantively in there, I think I would say. And then amendment 7 was voted on and approved by the assembly. So those are the ones that have been added to the S version. However, I think Ms. Arms caught something that we put in the S version that maybe is potentially problematic that'll have to be fixed.
Can you walk through those numbers again?
Yeah, sorry.
Number 1 was,
So no, amendment number 1 was not incorporated into the S version.
okay, number 2
Number 2
added.
was added. Number
three.
3 was voted on and voted down at the assembly meeting. Number 4 was added. Number 5 was added in part. And then number 6, we did not change language. Response to that. And then amendment number 7 was moved and approved at our last meeting.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Any other changes in the S version?
Is that okay? So the ones that were not incorporated, if the sponsors of those amendments feel comfortable answering this, maybe you're still mulling it over. Do you intend to bring those forward, or should we just let them go? I mean, for the sponsors of the amendments. Yeah,
You have one, Mr. Martinez, and no, I don't know is a great answer or yes. or
yeah.
no.
And you can say decline to answer for the time being too, if you're still mulling it over. I'm just curious.
No, I intend to move it unless it's incorporated into an S version.
Okay, thanks. And then I guess the other ones are from Member Silvers.
Yes, but I'll speak more when I
Have the floor back. Okay. She's in the queue. Was that it?
Actually, we were hoping to understand a bit more clearly Member Martinez's intent behind amendment number 1. We weren't quite sure what he was driving at, and that was actually the reason that it wasn't incorporated, was we weren't clear on what the goal was. So if Member
So we
Martinez,
have the queue first. If he
Okay.
wants to, I'll put him in the queue. That's a good question. So I don't require you to answer, but I have your name on the list when we come to it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Fair. No, it's, yeah, fair question. You don't have to answer. Is the thing. Okay, so I have myself in the queue now. So in the context of fines, that previous conversation and endlessly accruing fines, is it legal for us to establish a line at which point there are sufficient enough fines recorded on the property that we can move to possess the property and take ownership through the courts? Is that a lawful practice if the code were to provide it?
Yes. I mean, that is the ordinance that we're working on.
Okay, essentially, if you accrue enough fines that are recorded, then there's clearly that it's in excess of the 50% of the value of your property. We are suddenly the owner of that property and can move to take it.
Yeah, that's not how the ordinance is written. There is no dollar attached to it, no dollar value attached to it. It's any point we want to, we can move to foreclose.
On, even if it's just one fine of $500?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't, but.
I know we wouldn't. I'm just trying to understand, are the courts gonna find a reasonable standard there, though? Like, it's not reasonable, $500 to take someone's property versus, you know, $100,000 property, for example, with $60,000 of penalties. That's a clear answer. Is there any gray in that? Do we need that kind of benchmark, or does it not matter?
Need a benchmark. I can't sit here and tell you what the courts are gonna do with it. We've researched it. There isn't a clear answer, especially in Alaska. Courts have looked at whether the amount of fines are proportional to what's been done. Yeah, that is a consideration.
So it's not this project, I guess, when that project comes forward, some kind of way for us to look at that reasonableness standard would be very helpful. I call it reasonableness because we've been having this talk at length, like what
Yeah.
point of fines upon a property would be considered reasonable for this kind of an action to proceed. But that's another project. So I have one more question. Ms. Orr's brought the example of, can we just replace the boiler? I want us to be very careful not to provide benefits to bad operators, right? So if we were to go in and replace a $50,000 boiler and remove all of their asbestos, because once we found it, we've got to do it, and de-lead the paint all around everything, and clean up the oil spill at the bottom of their previous oils, and then all of a sudden their property is worth a whole lot more and we paid for it. That's a great benefit to somebody who's already proven that their only interest is in extracting wealth from a community and leaving people behind. And so I think that there is a path through the fines that, in my opinion, is more reasonable than us taking on the job of the landlord, leaving the actual bad landlord with a gift at the end. Right? To me, because I've seen them and I've seen how they act. And some of these folks have benefited greatly from our rental assistance programs. We've actually kept them in business because they're providing housing at the low end, but in a way that is disastrous. And so, and again, it's a couple people. It's not a big list of people. Next in the queue is Mr. Johnson, Ms. Silvers, Ms. Brawley, Mr. Martinez. Mr. Johnson.
I'm actually gonna take myself out of the queue. I think it was to
Ms.
speak to the amendments, which we already did.
It's fine. But if you want, you could go now because she had already spoken once.
Sure, right on. Thank you, Member Silver. Just to speak to amendment number 1, which is pretty straightforward, following the language of narrowly tailored solution, identifying a bit more protection for unforeseen, non-negligent circumstances.
Do you have a question,
Yeah,
Ms. Baldwin?
thank you. Can you give an example of an unforeseen circumstance not caused by the owner's neglect, separate and apart from a natural disaster?
I would rather approach it from the vantage point of saying there are things that are the original language says the violations resulting from conditions arising from a natural disaster, including, and it lists 4 things. It would seem to me that there are other things that would be considered natural disasters, potentially other categories. It also would seem to me that if the intent is to target bad actors, there are other unforeseen circumstances that are beyond those particular ones that are identified in language. I don't think it's valuable to test my imagination of those other circumstances. I think it's more valuable to identify that those limited naturals 4 that were identified don't cover the totality of unforeseen, non-negligent circumstances that an owner might find themselves in. And I also think of the generational relationship of folks who don't have the resources, who are, like at one point in time thinking of how to build financial legacy for their family, and health is one of those other types of unforeseen circumstances that potentially impacts the ability to be an owner. And I think that that's, again, some other types of unforeseen circumstances that may be otherwise able to be recognized, that are identified by unforeseen.
So to follow up on that, you're talking about these unforeseen circumstances being unforeseen circumstances of the tenant, not necessarily of the property owner, or both?
I believe that the nature of the part of the section of the ordinance has very little to do with either party, or definitely not the tenant, and it has to do with, generally speaking, this is what I read, that the unforeseen circumstances that are identified in section 2, that you all have identified as natural disaster, seems to be speaking to the inability for the owner to maintain the property up to the standard. So it's not about the tenant in that particular case. So similarly, it would be the unforeseen circumstances, non-negligent unforeseen circumstances with respect to the ownership.
So you suggested a health concern. So are you suggesting that this amendment would allow a landlord to say, I had a heart attack, I can't take care of my property anymore, therefore you can't move against my property to ensure that people who are living in my building have heat?
The contemplation of the range of conditions that are unforeseen and non-negligent seem broad enough that natural disasters of the 4 identified don't quite cover the range of unforeseen, non-negligent circumstances. So again, I don't have the imagination necessarily, and the limited imagination that I offered should not be the totality of what I'm describing
I heard
as.
health, and so I think if I were a bad operator, I could probably come up with any number of personal factors that would send these folks into a legal quandary. Well, I can't do anything now because they said, their son just had to move back in and they've got no means. And that's not negligent. That's a circumstance that just arose. And so I'm not saying you're saying that. This says not limited to a natural disaster, which means it's not just these things or things like it. It's any number of other things that could exist. And so
There are, correct, any number, I would just to respond. It is implied that there are other unforeseen, non-negligent circumstances, that there are many other number of things. That is exactly implied in that. But I would just go back to the nature of this original ordinance describes that there is no test whether or not the earthquake caused. This just describes that an earthquake would be the trigger of why you wouldn't be penalized. But you still have to actually prove that the earthquake necessarily caused the damage on that property. Just because we had an earthquake, you're going to have people say, my foundation, which was shitty yesterday, now all of a sudden I'm going to sneak it in. So I think there's still the range of testing is still there, and it's an applicable part of how to determine whether or not someone meets the criteria. But the criteria still needs to be tested even if there's 4. The point of the amendment is I could imagine other unforeseen, non-negligent circumstances that we would not want to penalize the owners in those circumstances for, similarly to the natural disasters that have been identified.
thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Johnson.
Just a quick question for the attorneys. So we say natural disasters such as, and I don't think we're meaning to limit it to only those 4. Is there for the lawyers, is there a more broad definition of a natural disaster that we could use? Or is it really just limited to whatever we explicitly name in the ordinance?
No, it's not limited to what you explicitly name. As it stands without this amended language, it is limited to natural disasters. whereas the amended language shifts it to a much broader
Yeah, I guess
category of unforeseen circumstances.
in the original language, when we say natural disasters, I mean, there could theoretically be things that we would define as natural disasters that aren't limited just to earthquake, tsunami, windstorm, or wildfire. Yeah, okay.
Am I mistaken in my read here, though, that the phrase that says including but not limited to a natural disaster means it's any number of other circumstances other than natural disasters, that essentially the list of natural disasters doesn't really matter all that much. This is creating an entirely new undefined classification of elements that might be considered non-negligent. You know, like they got laid off from their job, or they had a seizure of their finances because they were a drug dealer. I don't know, that might be negligent, but so, right, there's any universe of potential is what that reads to me. I'm not an attorney, but
So you're speaking to the proposed amended
Yeah.
language in Amendment 1.
Yep.
So yes, the amended language expands it to an unforeseen circumstance, with the limiting factor then being that it wasn't caused by the owner's neglect. So any unforeseen circumstance, and the
no, it includes
It would
natural
include natural-
disasters, but it is not limited to natural
Right, correct.
disasters, which is unbounded, right? The only bounding is that it is perceived to be non-negligent
that,
and unforeseen.
yeah, unforeseen and not caused by the owner's neglect. Correct.
Both of those are the two variables, the limiting variables, unforeseen and non-negligent. Okay. I think that's the answer. Anyone else on that amendment? Or here? Okay. Thanks, George. Interesting to contemplate. Ms. Silvers.
Okay, so I will go to amendment number 6 and talk about that one a little bit. What I've done there is taken out the illegal, because what we're asking landlords to do is to take on the liability for issues that could be caused by tenants that don't reach the level of illegality. And so I think that is kind of problematic. I asked some scenarios. One of the scenarios that I asked, I sent this to Quincy, was if the tenant boils water on the stove for long periods of time on a frequent basis to increase humidity, I've had this happen in one of my units before, and causes major mold issues that eventually lead to a notice to quit being issued, is the landlord responsible? The answer that you gave me was on a case-by-case basis, the landlord may be responsible or may be fit under this exception. So the landlord could actually be responsible for that. She went on to say that code enforcement has never issued a notice to vacate based on mold alone. Just because something has never happened doesn't mean that it won't in the future, particularly when you're changing code. So things that may not have happened before under a previous code could happen under the new code. So I guess a question I would ask you is, do you see current code enforcement or future code enforcement posting notices to vacate more often due to the change in code, or using that in place of some of the other things that you're using now?
No.
One of the other questions that I asked in here, so another circumstance, tenant leaves windows open and pipes freeze, causing flooding and leading to notice to quit. And Quincy said same answer as above. So I assume that means on a case-by-case basis, the landlord may be responsible. So I just think asking landlords to take on liability for these issues, if they're caused by a tenant, you've said that this is supposed to be very narrowly tailored. And I believe that your intent is for it to be narrowly tailored, but I think the policy itself is very broad. And it allows that kind of liability to fall on a landlord if code enforcement so chooses.
I have a quick question there.
Okay.
So if a landlord has a tenant that leaves the windows open and the pipes freeze, and then they don't fix it. And then a month goes by and all the tenants in their building don't have heat. And then code enforcement gets involved and says, you got to fix this. There are people freezing in your building. We have a minimum heat standard. And they say, it's someone else's fault. They did it. Are they not at some point legally responsible to bring their unit back up to livability? I mean, at what point does this exception that you're trying to carve become that they are the generator of the problem themselves, even though they weren't the first, because they refused to actually fix the problem? And on an ongoing basis, we have some buildings where stuff just never gets fixed, and people are living in freezing buildings for years now, going to year 2. And so at what point does it then become owned by the owner as opposed to the causer? So that's a question I would like to chew on, Mr. Cleek.
Can I say one thing? I've been a code abatement officer.
Turn the mic on.
Everyone hear me? So I've been a code abatement officer for a little more than 6 years. And we are based off a complaint-based system. I have, not saying that it would never happen, but I have yet to be called by a landlord complaining about a tenant that they've had. It's always been people that are less fortunate, that don't have first and last month's rent. They're not going to be able to walk up and, get a new place to move to. So it's a serious thing that it's unfortunate, but yeah, so we don't take it lightly at all.
And then here's the other kind of issue on the opposite end of this piece, and I haven't prepared an amendment for this, but it kind of on the opposite end of this, where we are kind of picking winners and losers among tenants, who will receive relocation assistance and who will not. If their neighbor has done, major damage doing something illegal, now they're not going to get that relocation assistance. And so in some cases, you're asking the landlord to take on liability for something that's caused by a tenant. In other cases, you're telling a tenant, well, that was actually caused, by illegal activity, so you're not going to get the relocation assistance. And so for me, that kind of brings to mind the mechanism. And I wonder if a better mechanism for this would be to use the fines, strengthen your ability to collect on the fines, create a pool of money with those fines that you can actually pay the relocation assistance out of, and not pick winners and losers amongst the tenants depending on who is responsible. So I kind of have a little bit of issue on this, on both ends. And I just wonder if the mechanism can be changed in order to not have those winners and losers, but, actually you have the fines, you collect on the fines, you strengthened that ability, and you pay the relocation assistance out of those fines in a way that's tax neutral. And, every tenant that is forced to move because of a notice to vacate gets that assistance.
I hear your point on that, but these ideas that we're working with now have come from these gentlemen's 6 years of service to this community. These are ideas that they've come up with because we're trying to do exactly what you're trying to do, and we're not getting there. We can't collect fines. That's why we're going to this step. For those of you who don't know, over 80% of all of the multifamily housing, 5 units or more in this town, are built before 1984. During those years of construction, there were no inspections. There was very limited, if any, engineering, and most of these were built with unqualified labor.
Yep, quick.
Now you're talking about doing that in the harshest environment to build on the face of the planet with the highest earthquake zones. I'm going to be frank, our buildings suck. And you know what? There's a lot of people out there who own them who refuse to put money into them. They're cash cows. We've seen some crazy things from corporations that I would never expect on this job. And what we're trying to do right now is develop tools that we can use to combat this, because it's going to come hit us hard in the next 10 years. These buildings are going to come offline unless they get rehabbed, remodeled, or torn down and rebuilt. And so what we're trying to do right now is get ahead of the game. If we don't, we're in trouble.
Mr. Hurt, on that topic?
May I on that?
Put me
Okay.
at the bottom of the queue, please.
You can wait, yeah. So Mr. Johnson, then I have myself in the queue. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, I think, see, I touched on something interesting. You mentioned how this is a growing problem because of our aging housing stock. And I mean, as we have talked about elsewhere, within the municipalities, it's very hard for people to build new construction really to meet the need, especially around the large multifamily we're talking about. Can you maybe elaborate just a little bit more on where you see this connection between what we're trying to achieve here to promote investment in these properties and how that plays into the larger housing market, right? I mean, about that balance between sort of how useful is it to promote and encourage upkeep of existing housing stock compared to the other side where we're looking at how do we build more? I mean, can you speak to that nexus at all?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of buildings in here that were built actually pretty good over the years. They're few and far between. But those individuals who do maintain their residence and they do keep them up, it is easy to continue to maintain them. And that's a simple fact, but you have to put the money into the establishment. And that's what we're seeing is some properties, so little money has been put into them over the course of the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years that the cost to rehabilitate that structure, because you would have to bring it up to current code standards, current insulation standards, thermal standards, it's going to be more expensive for you to redo that complex than it is to just tear it down and start over again. So some of these buildings, it's important that we get these landlords to start making sure that they maintain their structures, because eventually it's not going to just be 100 people this year. It could be 200 next year. It could be 300.
I guess more narrowly, sorry, in the status quo, there is a way for a company to make money without making any sort of investment whatsoever into the upkeep of the property they own. Yeah,
Yes.
that's sort of a viable business model
Mhm.
today.
What we have seen is companies that are a shell of a shell of a shell of one of major corporations. They come in, they jack rents up, they find new ways to add small charges to the customers who are already strapped for cash. They come up with bogus ideas how to get them out of the residence so that they can move somebody and charge a higher rent. As soon as they make their 15% on the property, they divest.
All right, I have myself in the queue and I have a few thoughts on this whole area. I think that my experience has been that every year we struggle to find enough funding to allow this team to get ahead of the curve ever. And that curve is the tearing down old buildings, taking possession of structures that are poorly inhabited by infested with drug dealers that are kind of, I don't even like, just that property in Mountain View comes to mind right across from the park next to Jamar Hill's new thing where it's insane. It's burnt down and there are still people transacting drugs and there's nothing we can do because we don't have the money. And so the idea of relying on the fines to fund people to move out would be directly taking funds out of the funding that we have moved into the fund to actually abate the problem and shift the properties from the trajectory they're on to some new pathway. Now, I have seen the administration working on a proposal that is going to look at all of the funds that we have in these various categories. And I will say that what I have seen, and I'd say it's their bias, which might be a little bit fed by code enforcement, is that the general timber of the field is these are mostly tear downs and we need to start over. And I hate that thinking. I hope that we do some real analysis of what's truly a tear down and what can be restored, and that we do make investments in properties to keep them whole and lasting longer. Because I don't think any of this that we're doing right now motivates anybody to invest anything. I think that this is actually aimed very narrowly at the people who have practically proven a commitment to not doing anything. Right? This is going to the people who have demonstrated a true commitment to being terrible. Like their actions, it can't be anything other than with intent, I guess would be the standard. It is not reasonable. It's the knew or should have known what they were doing was And that's what I think this project lays out. It doesn't actually move the ball to that other conversation, which is where the funding we've appropriated to help bring properties back. That's the cheese to help get things moving, that and other elements like it. And I hope we do investigate more of those strategies because that is important. You just described it. We could have hundreds, if not thousands of properties falling into this category within the next 10 years, just based on the life cycle of a building. I think we saw a beautiful graphic about life cycle of buildings at one of these work sessions and how you can reboot that. Anyhow, so next in the queue, Mr. Hurt, then Ms. Silvers, then Mr. Martinez. Oh,
Thank you, Chair. I did want to address one of the concerns that was raised about a future runaway code enforcement department, and just point out that the code language in Title 15 has an appeal process for any notice of violation or notice to vacate or anything like that. So the administrative hearing officer would exist as a check on a malicious code enforcement that might be abusing a landlord or taking advantage of the way the code's being framed. So I did want to point that out just for the benefit of the assembly, if that was a concern.
Okay, and then I have, I can't read my writing. Who's next in the queue? Martinez, I think. Oh, yeah, it's Martinez. Silvers Martinez, probably okay. Can't read my writing. I left off a Z.
So I'm still having a little bit of trouble squaring in my mind the broadness of the policy with the narrowness of the intent. But I think I can get there. I guess what I want to ask you is, would it be a hardship to the department if we put in here some kind of requirement that you provide a yearly report on when this notice to vacate was used, and when the relocation fees were required, and kind of what steps were taken before a notice to vacate was given, and kind of what, basically a reporting back to us how you're using this code change.
Absolutely. I think the most important thing that we try to be is transparent. And if you were here when we vacated 101 Bunnell or 1471 West 26th, I mean, these guys were working around the clock, and myself as well, constantly communicating with the assembly, the administration at the time, other entities that were involved, Red Cross, Alaska Coalition on Homelessness, the health department, all of our nonprofits, the Salvation Army. There was a lot of communication, and that's the only way we were able to actually get everybody out of that residence and into a safe location, is by having that coordination and that communication. So absolutely, if we ever had to post this, we would definitely communicate, make sure that everybody knew what was going on while we were doing it.
Okay. Good, because I think you're doing good work, and I don't want to hinder your work. But I just have some concern about if there's a future code enforcement where we're not getting the transparency, or they are using this more broadly, because the policy itself does allow it to be pretty broad, and a lot of it is based on discretion. And so would the sponsors of this be willing to put in here some kind of requirement of a yearly report to the assembly of when, why, and how it was used?
Yeah, I don't think we'd have a problem with that. I'm just chuckling. We'll add it to the 1001 in the list of reports due to the assembly on an annual basis, but we can
Thank
put that in,
you.
I think.
CEDC gets a monthly report, so these could be ongoing too, but it's fine to put in the code. We are out of time. Does anyone further have questions? I guess Mr. Martinez, time for your last one, and Ms. Prawley.
Just to flag in that discussion, Chair, you described, you were talking about the funding, and I wanted to reiterate, I really appreciate the difference between the relocation funding and the funding that you described as the cheese that we really need to get these buildings moving on. And so I just wanted to make sure members heard that too. But there's another thing strikes me as interesting as we talked about the debate or the amendment number 1. And I just wanted to flag that presumably a natural disaster occurring does not necessarily give the coverage to the owner. You described a pattern of neglect that presumably there's a test to see how that pattern of neglect is defined, which would apply to also unforeseen, non-negligent circumstances. So you wouldn't get a blanket because an earthquake doesn't give you carte blanche in, because you still have to define that you had some degree of neglect from after the earthquake that then impacted the tenants. And you also have to test whether or not there was actually, the earthquake was the cause. And so it seems that just thinking of how we test the long-term negligence is something, whether they're foreseen or not, which category seems something to really hone in on a little more.
I'll
Thank
be
you.
really clear. I had no concern about the natural disaster part. It was that other caveat that was, and other things, that's the area that's very broad, and I don't know.
Right, but I'm concerned about the earthquake because we just heard from code enforcement that a crap load of buildings weren't built with qualified regulations,
Right.
standards, or even buildmanship, and they're gonna come online.
Right.
And is it the last earthquake? Is it the next one? Is it the pre-existing condition of neglect? So the test, I think, is still important to
I
identify.
think the biggest natural disaster we're facing is a fire at this point. But you never know. That's why they're disasters. Ms. Brawley, to close us out.
Yeah, thanks. And I think beyond this ordinance, I really appreciate the framing of how kind of dire our housing stock situation is, not all of it. And to the point about fire, most of it is wood. Many older cities are built from bricks and stone, which are much harder to burn. But I think also something to keep in mind for buildings, the economic replacement issue is if it's too expensive to build, we may have to tear them down. That's an unfortunate condition, but it makes me think of a car. At some point you total a car. Insurance companies have the concept of totaling a car. And what it sounds like is we have more and more of our buildings that are essentially totaled. And that's really sad. And so we have to protect the folks living in them. So anyway.
Well, they're totaled and people continue to make huge amounts of profit off of those units that are effectively totaled with no recourse, except for levying of fines, which will never be captured because. So, and thank you, everybody. We'll be back here in 10 minutes to kick off a special meeting. Nobody leave.